All right, everyone, welcome to the Energeia podcast. This is Dr. G, and today it's my pleasure to welcome to the show William Luse. Will is an assistant professor of management in the Department of Management and Leadership at the College of Business and Public Management at the University of Laverne in Laverne, California, just outside of LA. William holds a PhD in Management and Organizational Studies from the University of Texas at San Antonio, as well as an MBA from Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. His research has been published in outlets such as Current Psychology and Equality, Diversity and Inclusion and International Journal, and has been presented at fora such as the Academy of Management and the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, where he is one of the Society's trend champions working on the subject of managing the transition into post-pandemic work. Will, welcome along. Thanks so much for being here with me today.
Hey, happy to be here. Really appreciate the invite and the opportunity to finally be on the podcast. I'm a big fan.
Oh, thank you very, very much. Your support means a lot, and it's really cool that you're doing this, man. And we originally linked up, as I recall, about 4 or so years ago now at this point through our mutual colleague, Kylie Rochford, who's now at the University of Utah. We struck up a bit of a connection initially over our shared interest in the role that human biology plays in shaping organizational behavior, and your dissertation research, which was entitled Face It, the Impact of Testosterone Exposure on Cooperation, Conflict Processes, and Workgroup Performance, was, in my mind, a really, especially for dissertation level work, a really fascinating study with a very, very original, interesting methodology. And in the study, or a couple of studies within the same dissertation, you examined the influence of testosterone on intragroup cooperation and team performance among NBA players. No coincidence I'm wearing my Mutombo jersey right now. Sounds like almost a kind of a dream study for someone who's as fanatical about both sports and biology-based organizational research as I am. So maybe just to kick things off, since that was kind of our point of connection, and given how great and cool I think your dissertation research was, could you walk us through how you undertook that study, maybe what initially got you interested in undertaking this research, the methodology you employed, and maybe some of the conclusions and implications for organizational behavior that you were able to draw from this research?
All right, more than happy to. So long story short, I ended up in this line of research, at least for my dissertation, because I had always had an interest in how organizations impacted employees and their health, such as programming, stress and things like that. But I was encouraged to look at things the other way, as far as, well, how does employees' biology impact outcomes for organizations? And I went from there, but I immediately ran into the question of, how do we measure biology? Or how can we measure biological individual differences in a non-intrusive way, where, of course, we could go the route of swabbing people's mouths or drawing their blood or measuring their cortisol, which is fine and good. But I was looking for a more novel way to capture this. And testosterone exposure, which was the topic of my dissertation, was a way to do this, with the idea being that it's not always people's current physiological, biological states that influence their behavior, but the physiological, biological experiences they've gone through in the past that impact their behavior. With the idea behind testosterone exposure, just to condense it down for podcast form, the idea is that, we experience exposure to testosterone and other hormones during our development, and this base exposure to testosterone sets the stage for our nervous system, which then influences our behavior later on in life, where it's not the only influence. Of course, we have nature, nurture, other hormones at play, but this does play some role. And going along with that idea, I started to read some of the literature on the topic, a lot of great studies in behavior econ, social psych, and things like that, which were very interesting, but they didn't really capture what happened when people work together. They were more so individual based. So for example, testosterone exposure increased risk taking. which is an important finding to know, practically speaking, and research scholarly speaking. But most of the work we do in organizations and most of the things we do, just the way we do life in general, we do it with and through people, and we do it in small groups. Especially if you subscribe to some of the research in evolutionary biology, that small groups are where we operate best or where our sweet spot is. So I decided to do this like, hey, let's look at this in teams or these small groups. And I thought of a lot of sports, there was originally, American football. I'm like, yeah, that's cool, but there really isn't a lot going on. And there's this, in my opinion, this disproportionate emphasis on quarterbacks, which are leaders of the team. But there are other players at stake. But instead, I was looking for a context where at least team members were on relatively level ground. Of course, there were positions and different roles to fill. And also where they worked very interdependently to get tasks done. And that led me to basketball, which I'm a big fan of watching. The NBA Finals are on now, and also playing recreationally. So in basketball, I was able to do this where the basketball teams have positions, and there's one ball, which I was getting a little ahead of myself. So there are positions on the team, there's also one ball, where we can have ball hogs, we have people that want to do everything on the court, and we've all probably experienced this, whether we're playing casually or played team sports at some time in our lives. Dealing with the ball hog is not necessarily fun, right? Also, dealing with teammates that don't do their part also isn't fun either. And the idea with the first study of my dissertation was that, when we have these teams that are working together and we have the possibility of ball hogs, we have the possibility of teammates not doing their part, what's going to happen when we have people of varying testosterone exposure levels on these teams? And my first study showed that, when you have more players on a team that experience higher testosterone exposure, which was measured through their facial photos that were available online, these teams tend to perform better, both in terms of their interdependent performance, or in other words, their reciprocal task performance, being their field goal percentage, just shooting from the field, and also in their pooled task interdependence performance, being that they're shooting from the free throw line, with the idea being that teams have to work together to select and take the best shots from the field. But free throw shooting in of itself is a independent contribution to the team's product. Now there are definitely other things that go into play as far as that goes, in which I'll readily admit. But the idea, and to make this and to take this to the very extreme level, the idea of a big testosterone guy going to the free throw line and shooting more free throws is really counterintuitive, right? But that's what my study showed, that, this testosterone exposure helps teams, but it was especially helpful under these pooled task interdependence conditions where team members can work separately to make their contributions.
Yeah, look, just so much about just the conception of this study and kind of like your rationale for why you chose basketball as the kind of like proxy sport for sort of team interdependence in general, I think is absolutely fascinating. Just the idea of the ball hog as well. I think you're absolutely right that basketball uniquely is this kind of sport. I'm from New Zealand. I grew up watching rugby, sports like that. There's no advantage to you as an individual to hold on to the ball in a sport like rugby, because you're going to get tackled, dragged to the ground, and you're going to hold up your team's progress. But basketball really is a sport where you do have a reasonable amount of latitude to kind of showboat, to hog the ball, to be in. And I just finished watching that great show about the Lakers on HBO Max, which was absolutely phenomenal. And we've seen instances throughout the history of basketball of it being the sport which is known for producing relatively selfish players in the context of a necessary team interdependence. So I just think, again, the rationale for how you arrived at basketball specifically as this kind of proxy for interdependence generally is fantastic. And maybe just to just expand a little bit on the methodology. because as you said, like the FWHR stuff like 2D, 4D, like digit ratio measurement and stuff like that. These are all relatively straightforward and very, very reliable and valid measures for testosterone. Obviously it's not going to capture everything like an actual t-test would, actually sampling someone's testosterone directly. But given how much predictive power those tests have, limited though they may be, and given how good a set of predictors they are and how non-invasive they are, it's always struck me as a little bit puzzling that they've not been used more in organizational research. How much more research in, say, OB or IO Psych are you aware of that's actually employed measures like the ones that you used?
Well, I've seen a couple of studies, a handful, since I was working on my dissertation and published it, but there really hasn't been a lot out there. And I think there are several reasons why, where I think some people have their concerns about using biological data in organizations, which is a valid concern. I also think there's also this thread or idea that when people hear about biology, they think that it is or could be used in a deterministic way. We're saying, like, this is the smoking gun I've been looking for. This is the biological trait that we think influences behavior. And I say that, well, absolutely not. That's not the case at all, right? And it's incorrect to think that just these things alone predict behavior, but instead, it's many individual differences at play. And also, something that my dissertation research shows is that it's just not the biology, but it's the context in which people are behaving that has a very powerful influence on the outcomes.
Yeah, and I mean, I totally get that there are perhaps reasonable reservations about introducing biology into the mix, particularly when you have this sort of over-deterministic approach going into it. But to me, that's actually a very, very low bar for people to not be able to, traverse. That's just the basic naturalistic fallacy in my eyes. This idea that I think people equate, and I've noticed this a lot more in fields like OB compared to other social sciences, which I'll touch on in a moment. But I feel like people equate determinism in some sense with fatalism. That if you've got innate traits or something's to do with your biology, that you're predestined to act in some particular way. I mean, like you said, there's obviously so many more variables that go into the mix. Variables within your own biology, not just, if testosterone and sex hormones were destiny, we would be very, very different creatures to the ones we actually are. But I remember, when we first connected, I think we were, you push back where maybe we differ in this regard, but I seem to recall we were both broadly of the perspective that there wasn't enough work being done in this space, that, the idea of the biological basis of organizational behavior more generally, and B, that the lack of work being done in this space was a golden opportunity to do work in this space. I had Steve Colorelli from Central Michigan University on my podcast on the first episode. He's the editor, you might be familiar, of the textbook, The Biological Foundations of Organizational Behavior. And he's of the opinion that the organizational and managerial sciences really are playing several laps of catch-up behind some of the other social sciences in this respect. And he's certainly not alone in making this observation that organizational, we were sort of talking about the idea that organizational scholarship and, the managerial sciences still treat, the valid concerns aside, they still treat biology-based research as something of a novelty, or sort of outside the purview and priorities of, mainstream organizational research. And I would argue that it's so not a novelty. The idea that biology is going to ultimately have some downstream influence on behavior, that to me seems like such a humdrum, banal observation, that the idea that it would seem novel, not just to OB scholars, but I would say the preponderance of OB scholars. I think this is kind of reflective. I don't want to sort of put the overly pessimistic topspin on it, but I think it's kind of left us languishing in something of a scientifically incomplete era compared to other applied social sciences. I mean, what are your thoughts here? I mean, is there a future for this type of research in OB and IO Psych? I mean, you know, you tell me if you plan to be part of that future or not, but I mean, does that impasse to you seem problematic? And if so, is there a sort of profitable way forward from here?
No, I think that it should be a part of the future of organizational behavior, industrial psychology research, where I'm of the opinion that it should be treated and regarded just like any other individual difference that we measure and study. But I think one reason why we're a little hesitant to approach it is that we think that biology is out of our purview because we view it as more of a quote unquote hard science, and you know, we let the people that are experts in the hard sciences do their research on that topic or on those topics. And I also think too that something else that's going on is that, well, people also don't know how to ground the biological markers, and not just necessarily the markers itself, but measures in a relevant organizational context, right? Where I remember distinctly working on my dissertation and reading some of the empirical literature more closely related to our field on the topic, and you know, it was pretty straightforward, which is good. And you need that to start a literature, so to speak, right? But it eventually has to grow from that, where we need, and to get very method-y real quick, we need to study moderators, we need to study mediators, we need to consider the temporal aspects of these things, we need to consider context. And I think that that's the path forward, instead of us just looking at these relatively simple direct relationships that I came across a couple of years ago. And personally, I would love to do more work on this topic, where I think that not just testosterone exposure, but when I think about cortisol and stress, especially with all that's going on in the world the past couple of years, I think that looking at those variables in the context of other individual differences, personality, and things like that, I think that would not only make research that is theoretically or scientifically interesting, but research that is useful to society going forward.
Absolutely. And I think an important caveat, just to a point you just made there, is that one thing we have to keep in mind is that the more precise the methodologies become, and the more hormones that we're bringing into the mix, and the more, to your point about research methods, that we're making things like the influence of other hormones, the influence of other neurotransmitters, the more we want to make those things tractable in OB research and IO Psych research, the more expensive it's going to get. And so I think part of the issue may be that for your average IO Psych or OB researcher that, who's just trying to get a study funded, just trying to get something in a good journal or something like that, the idea of proposing, like a lot of the, you look at, fields like, let's say nutritional biochemistry and stuff like that, the studies that they have to undertake to pass, a kind, their disciplines kind of bare minimum empirical muster are so much more expensive than the studies that we typically undertake in OB and IO Psych, where you can, administer a bunch of surveys and, like not to downplay the validity and the reliability of these measures, but they're a lot more straightforward to administer. They're a lot cheaper to administer. And so I'm sort of, wary of the fact that, I share your enthusiasm for trying to move this forward, but I'm also sort of, mindful of the fact that when we do start to push into those avenues, the parameters for funding research in our space is going to change. Now, that actually might help set a very, very good precedent. Like if you get a couple of very good OB or IO Psych studies with a strong biological foundation, a more complex biological theoretical basis get approved and get funded and end up getting published and they end up being good studies, then hopefully that opens the floodgates. But it feels like we're kind of at the moment still sort of trapped in that little bit of an impasse waiting for that to open up. What do you think about that?
No, absolutely agree. Where I see a couple of studies come out every year. There are actually some really interesting studies on testosterone exposure in the entrepreneurship literature. And it kind of plays on the idea, and don't quote me specifically on this, but it kind of plays on the idea that, well, we have all these potential influences that could make someone become an entrepreneur, whether it be their household, certain personality traits, what they were exposed to when they were younger. We should also consider biological individual differences, right? Which is a relatively simple premise. It's not out there in left field, but rather they're saying like, hey, this is just one individual difference that we should consider. In a way, they're done similar to the twin studies that I'm pretty sure that you and some of the people listening in the audience are familiar with the idea being that it's just not nature, it's just not nurture that can have this influence, but we are more focused on the nature part right now, and we're trying to answer this question of, well, to what extent does testosterone exposure impact preference for entering entrepreneurship? And I don't know if there have been any studies on entrepreneurial success yet, but things along those lines.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so much. I think this is kind of the beauty and the tragedy of the literature being in the sort of state that it's in, is that we haven't maybe advanced things enough along as fast as, say, you or I may have preferred, but we have wide open pastures in front of us. There is plenty of good research still to be done. I feel like with something like this, there are so many kind of pre-formed hypotheses just sitting on kitchen tables in PhD students, cramped apartments across America, just waiting to be cashed out in the lab, somewhere in academia. And I mean, just to stay with testosterone for a moment, though. I mean, for me, although there's developments in this area, it'd be interesting to see where it goes with, as you say, fields like entrepreneurship. I feel like testosterone levels and bioavailability, to me, these are possibly one of the most needlessly neglected and overlooked, yet also really promising sources of predictive data in the organizational sciences. We know so much from other disciplines about how this one particular hormone, not singularly, but in its own distinct, unique way, exerts real substantial influences on cognition, emotion, behavior, and there are so many reliable, just to go back to the ones that you've used yourself, good proxy measures. There's so many reliable, comprehensively validated measures we can use to assess it. And on top of that, and I think this is kind of the 500-pound elephant in the room on this topic, there's the obvious fact that men, particularly cisgendered men, have much higher levels and much higher bioavailability of testosterone compared to women, and particularly cis women. And it feels to me like this one in particular could be a veritable holy grail of new insights when it comes to understanding sex differences in the workplace. I mean, do you agree, A, that there's underutilized potential in assessing the role of testosterone in organizational life generally? Do you agree that it could really bear fruit for us in terms of, to the degree that we find the potential for sex differences in the workplace interesting? Do you think this could actually help shine a whole new whole new series of rays of light on this issue? And if so, what kind of research approaches do you think could bear the most fruit if scholars started to take advantage of this potential?
I would say yes, where I think it has good potential to explain some of the questions that we in organizational behavior, industrial psychology, ponder over and wrestle with. And as far as, how to incorporate it into studies, I think of things such as looking at the intersection between these measures and, let's say, something as simple as gender roles, right? Where the way we experience gender in the world just isn't, the boxes we check, so to speak, but it's also the expectations that people have of us because of the way they perceive us, right? And looking at it like that, we quickly come to the question of like, well, if people have these expectations of me, I want to behave in this way, or I want to behave in the way that I think that best fits my identity. And then I also have these biological factors at play as well. We put these three things together, answering the question of what happens is an interesting one, both practically and in terms of research.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually feel like when we talk about things like gender expression and gender identity, something like focusing on testosterone research for people that are non-cis, that opens up whole new avenues for that community and their ability to participate in meaningful organizational research. And I mean, not for nothing, people that are in transition as well are people who have had, a more intimate personal familiarity with the the day-to-day vagaries of their hormones than an average sort of cis person has had to ponder. So for me anyway, both in the cis community and the trans community and combined, I think sort of like trying to integrate a biological, a sober, measured, objective biological assessment of the role of hormones, neurotransmitters, and so forth. It's not mutually exclusive with also considering things like gender identity and gender expression. I think we should actually be looking at all of them together.
No, I absolutely agree. Where I even think studying gender identity and looking at it as a complete spectrum instead of, again, just the box that people check and the way we perceive others would be a profound step forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
No. So I would definitely think that's important. And then also, I think going forward too, when we look at where this will go in organizations, it's just not to me testosterone itself, but I really do wonder how these stress hormones and things like that impact us, where we all understand the sensation of feeling stressed out, right? And oftentimes we measure stress, pressure in organizations. We have these survey measures of stress where, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there are 5 survey items you complete, 3 to 5
Yep.
survey items, where I'm feeling stressed, I feel pressure. I don't ask them to recall the exact questions now. And, that's fine and good, but I wonder, what about that stress that I can't necessarily capture by having someone fill out a survey, where I can measure their cortisol levels? Because when I think about the day-to-day interactions we have in the workplace, where at moments our stress levels can be really high, they can spike. Other moments, they can be really low or at a relatively normal level. And again, to me, getting back to the idea of context, the context where behavior is occurring, I would want to know, what's making people's stress levels spike, or, what happens when people's stress levels spike, or they feel that they're in danger of other things when they are in certain situations in the workplace, and what are the consequences of that?
Absolutely. And just to sort of close the loop on that particular topic, I just use a word that you use, I think, in the abstract for your dissertation, triangulating. Let's triangulate different, those stress measures, like you say, there might be 5-item measures, that in and of itself may seem incomplete, but triangulated with, like you say, cortisol, a bunch of other maybe different stress measures. All right, now we've got a little bit of a comprehensive Monte Carlo of data starting to go now. It's not just a singular variable that's being analyzed. So yeah, I think that's incredibly important. But we've spent a bit of time on that area. I want to move on to some of your other research foci, if I may. So yourself and Daryl Rice co-authored a paper in Current Psychology. How does organizational justice impact supervisor bottom line mentality, the role of the institutionalization of ethics? Many of us in the OB world will be familiar with this concept of perceived organizational justice, this sort of perceived fairness of outcome distribution and allocation, the perceived equity of things like even interpersonal relationships in the workplace. But I'm personally even having read the paper, I'm personally less familiar with the bottom line mentality and then this idea of supervisor bottom line mentality. So could you explain this idea a little bit and also discuss what you found in this particular research?
Well, bottom line mentality, and specifically supervisor bottom line mentality, is the idea that supervisors, or it could be anyone in the organization actually, are more concerned with profits, financial measures, especially profits, over the well-being of employees, right? And in our study, we looked at the bottom line mentality of supervisors and their employees' perceptions of it, and we found that, well, employees think that in a lot of cases that their supervisors do carry this mentality. But creating an ethical climate or an organization that has respect for ethics and enforces ethical codes and guidelines reduces the impact of this bottom line mentality that supervisors can have, right? Where it's something that's, when we say it out loud and we think about it, we're like, oh, well, I expect that. That makes sense. And it's relatively simple to say out loud. But when we think about the implications that it could have for organizations and how we do life in organizations, it's really big, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think that's a very important point you've just made, almost alluding to the fact that, you arrive at a conclusion like that, and a lot of people will be like, well, I didn't need a study to tell me that. I could have told you that before a study. And actually, I find this sort of teaching at the university I teach at. Sometimes I will regale a piece of evidence about some OB or management topic to my students, and I feel like I'm saying something that's just commonsensical to the point of banality in their eyes, But this is the thing. Unless you do the research, the implications aren't actually clear in a lot of ways, and in fact, we only arrive in any kind of meaningful way at those implications when we've actually taken the time to do the research. So the idea itself may be something that you could pre-hypothesize, and many people could probably get through their lives by just assuming that is true. But until research like yours actually comes along to sort of cash out what might seem like just an intuitively plausible claim, the implications don't really reveal themselves in as illuminating a fashion as we need when it comes to, what is actually a very, very important consideration in the workplace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's really important for us to do this research when it comes to your more nuanced topics where context can have a very significant impact on outcomes. Where, for example, my study on supervisor bottom line mentality, yeah, it's like, well, it's pretty straightforward. But the ethical climate aspect of the organization is something that could be very important. Because what if your organization doesn't have an ethical climate? What if employees don't perceive it to be as such? And I just think of other things that could come in the future. Well, what about, how do we go about creating this? Or all these things that we don't know the answer to that can come from this relatively common sense, or what we think to be a common sense finding.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, on the other side of that, I feel like with something like the relationship between ethical climate and a bottom line mentality, there's a whole other segment of the population whose common sense view of this is that, and it's not one that I share, but their common sense view of it is that really ethical climates and really bottom line focused organizations are fundamentally irreconcilable. That too many people have just been burnt by the Enrons and the Madoffs and stuff of the world. And, that people just have this, almost caricature at this point, view in their mind of like capitalism run amok and, like these greedy cigar smoking Mr. Burns like executives sitting in a star chamber twirling their mustaches and, like talking about how much that, I'm caricaturing for effect here, but I feel like so much of the population still see this, this sort of foundational impasse between ethics on the one hand and actually maximizing the bottom line on the other hand. And it doesn't need to be that way, does it?
No, it doesn't. Where actually companies that are more ethical tend to perform better over time. And that's a finding, as you probably have experience, when you discuss this with your students, or with managers, if you even bring it up in some executive education programs, you probably get looks of confusion, so to speak.
Yeah.
But when you start to when you think about it a little further, it does make sense where if you break the rules, there are going to be consequences, and they can have reputational effects where people rarely want to work for an organization that runs roughshod over rules and regulations, right? And also on top of that, people may not want to work there or do business with them because it doesn't align with the values that they espouse.
Yeah, and look, that's ethical progress in society and business at large, right there. I mean, think of how difficult it would be these days for even an Enron, which was 20, 21 years ago or something like that. That it feels like that kind of scheming, that kind of malfeasance would just be like so much more difficult to pull off in the world now. Not just given the infrastructural difficulties and the higher risk of actually being exposed because of advances in technology, but also I just feel like in terms of cultural sea change, it's just kind of far less acceptable these days. And I mean, I shudder to think what it would have been like in the robber baron era, or even the 1940s or 1950s, where good luck even trying to be a whistleblower. Like how would you even start to be a whistleblower about an unethical company? In a time where presumably it was, very, very easy for companies to smoke and mirror their way out of ethical scrutiny at every turn.
Yeah, I can't imagine where now whistleblowers do certainly still face scrutiny now, but I can't imagine trying to do that same thing, let's say even 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Which in relative terms isn't not really that long ago.
No, it's not. I mean, I would just take the example of something like sexual harassment, as kind of the inflammatory but sort of obvious case that, late 70s or 80s, still obviously a rampant and disgraceful problem these days, but, the amount of, women that literally could not whistleblow in a situation involving themselves and their own immediate safety just because, to do so was basically a direct pathway to losing your job. I mean, thank God, we've moved somewhat beyond that. Still tragically, it's a tragic amount of that still transpiring in the workplace. But again, I can only imagine what trying to whistleblow and stuff like that would have been like in the 60s, 70s. God knows earlier.
Right. Absolutely agree with you.
Yeah. Hey, let's move on to some more of your research. So you also published this really interesting paper that I actually really, really enjoyed. You're collaborating with Chantal Van Esch, who's a former colleague of mine at Case Western Reserve. She's now a faculty member at Cal State Poly in Pomona, California. This was entitled "The Impact of COVID-19 Pandemic Concerns and Gender on Mentor-Seeking Behavior and Self-Efficacy." What are the broad strokes of what you discovered in this research, and what do you think are some of its major implications? What are those implications given that we're now transitioning into something of a post-COVID reality?
Well, we found that having a mentor in these times of uncertainty and transition matters, right? Because when we think about the conservation of resources theory, which is the idea that we all have different resource allotments, and just doing life can either drain these resources, enhance them, and we make it through the trials, tribulations, and challenges we face by turning to our resources, which in the case for many of us are our networks. And this brings us to mentorship, where our study found that people generally sought more mentorship as the initial shutdowns in spring of 2020, which I would say around March, second week of March or so for most of the United States. When that was occurring, people reached out to their mentors more. And especially those that were more concerned about the COVID-19 pandemic, which, again, is a little intuitive. If you're more concerned about this uncertain event that could have significant impact on your life, you're going to seek help from someone that you view as wise and understanding. And Individuals that reach out to their mentors also felt more confident in their transition to online work. But since we did this in the context, or we use a college level educator professor population, they were more confident in their transition to teaching remotely, right? And the implications for this are important, where it's just not giving people instructions or tools, which organizations often do, where they show you how to do something, but also being able to talk to someone and possibly, it's not just not trying to figure out how to do something, but talk to someone, have conversations, and feel supported in ways that build my confidence going forward matter just as not much, if not more.
Yeah, and that to me seems so, so beyond, those conclusions seem so beyond reproach in a lot of ways, just that obviously in a time like, the zeitgeist defining time that we've been through, just merely having the tools you need to do your job, like the infrastructure you need to do your job, the technical availabilities and affordances of your job, like having that all on hand is great. But it's not business as usual. And I think that just like experientially, where, mentorship has kind of, played an outsized role during the pandemic. And I expect much more in the early stages of the pandemic, where particular in America, it was very frightening times for a lot of people in a lot of places. To me, it just seems like mentors would play such an invaluable role. I could actually, but maybe I could probe you on this a little bit further with the gender thing. Like when it came to differences between the genders in terms of, did you find anything about like what initially prompted their mentorship? Like was this people that had, were these people, I should say, that had existing mentorship relationships in place, or ones that developed sort of as a result of the pandemic, people reaching out to seek support?
That's a really good question, where we did collect data on, well, who was this person or who you reached out to seek support from. And we didn't include it in the study because, as you know, with qualitative open-ended responses, you get a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
But I can say that just anecdotally, me glancing at the data we had, and this isn't, I'll note for the audience that this isn't an absolute finding from the study, that a lot of the people, as far as the whole population, a lot of the mentors that people reached out to, they were pre-existing. Not for everyone. But in quite a few cases, there were people that were reaching out and making connections over social media, and not necessarily in real time, but as I imagine challenges arose for them.
Yeah, sure, and I think that's almost an interesting. I totally take your point about qualitative research there as well, and you have to sort of rein things in at some point with qualitative research. But yeah, I mean that is perhaps an interesting. One of those, directions for future research or something like that, like maybe retrospectively, what was the experience like for people who had pre-existing mentors in place, sort of a pre-existing support network in place, their experience of the pandemic and their, self-efficacy in terms of transitioning back into the workforce and so forth, versus people who were prompted to get mentors as a result of, the stress and pressure they were under in the pandemic. Just maybe something for a future project. I'm not going to patent it or copyright it on the spot or anything.
No, absolutely. Where I think going forward, we are going to look at the gender dynamics that come into play here. And we discussed this in the paper, where we posed a very, I would say, straightforward question of, well, why did women reach out more? Right? Or do they feel like they're at a loss? Do they feel that they don't have the resources they need to make this transition? Or is there something else going on? And as you know, when we think about gender and its place in the workplace more generally, there are a lot of potential issues that could be at play here.
Oh, totally. And I mean, this area is so fraught with, like practical and conceptual landmines. I mean, I can't imagine, how much ground would need to be covered to get a really full and complete accounting of, like everything that potentially could influence that, that those outcomes either way in terms of gender differentiation. So I guess we'll have to table that for future research. Again, just go back to what we said earlier, more opportunities for the future, which is all good. So let's just talk about like your future ahead research-wise. What's in store for you in the future research-wise? I mean, anything in the pipeline that you can disclose? I'm not going to put you on the spot or anything too much, but I mean, any R&Rs that you're taking an eternity to get over the line that you can disclose, or I mean, anything else that you've just been musing on in your own mind as far as possible future research avenues are concerned, and maybe things that are kind of starting to capture your interest right now that might be the basis of your future research initiatives.
Well, there are a lot of things, because I have, and some of my other colleagues in the field have said, like, well, you come across as scattered and unfocused, but I just happen to find a lot of things interesting. And I feel like we as researchers, we do this to examine those questions as far as, workplace life. And I've gotten some pushback on that before, but, I feel like I'm going to do the things I'm interested in, but of course I am going to ground them in an organizational context. Where one thing that's interested me for a while, and I think about this trying to pursue this in some of my future research, is using sports data, sports and things like that to address some of those questions we have in terms of how people work together in organizations, right? Where I'm pretty sure you've encountered this, and it's something that I find kind of funny about the academic community, where you have a few people that are very much interested in sports. They're sports fans. They've played sports. They watch sports. They like playing with sports data and things like that. But we also have a lot of people, again, in the academic community that know nothing about sports, and I would say more interestingly, want nothing to do with it, and they think it has no place in organizational research. And they will very emphatically tell you that I don't think your study is relevant because you've used this type of data.
I think that's a crazy position for people to adopt, right? Like the two things I would say to that. One, I can totally accept the idea that if you study a sports team, you're studying an entity that's maybe, because sports is such a unique domain, a unique pursuit within humankind, you could make the claim, I think, that whatever findings you glean from studying a sports team are going to be difficult to extrapolate to your average, a company that makes shoes or something like that, or makes lead pipes. I could totally get that reservation. But on the other hand, when we're talking about sports teams, when we're trying to understand things like how people behave in groups, how stress affects people and stuff like that, I mean, it's not to trivialize the everyday stresses and pressures that people in, let's quote unquote, typical jobs experience. But man, if you're a professional athlete, a professional sports person, your performance in your job is under a freaking microscope. The bombardment of pressure from every angle to perform, to perform and perform well is leagues beyond what your average person is going to experience in their day-to-day job. And when I was working with MBAs back in America, I used the example of the All Blacks and the New Zealand national rugby team, how they were consistently the best rugby team in the world by far, but they choked at the World Cup every time, up until they finally won it again in 2011. They went through a 24-year, 6 World Cup period where between World Cups, they were number one team in the world, would thrash thrash England, thrash all the other big countries, France, Australia and stuff, and then get to the World Cup and bomb. And I always thought, this is a team, because, they are our national team, that, rugby is a religion of sorts in New Zealand. I just thought it was such an interesting case study in high level performative pressure, being under the microscope, being under this like lens of extreme scrutiny that your average Joe, again, without wanting to trivialize anyone's experience, but your average Joe working in an office is not going to go through. And thereby, by no means the only example here. We could take any number of examples from any professional sports. And I'm with you. I mean, to me, this seems like an undertapped, underutilized avenue of empirical inquiry. And I also agree with you that it just seems like so few academics are actually into sport and that they don't want anything to do with it. It just strikes me as kind of strange.
Yeah, I think it's really how can I say this? I really think it's an identity thing where not all, but let's say a moderate number, because I don't think it's the majority. But I think there is a segment of the academic community where their identity, academia, inquiry, reason, intelligence and things like that are part of their identity. But when it comes to athletic endeavors, that represents something to them that counters that intellectual side of them that they want to have no parts of. Now, they may not say that out loud, but I think that plays some role in that pushback. Instead of it just being purely a methodological, research context kind of issue. Where, when I think about Academy of Management are the largest conference for management scholars in our field, almost every year we have a session on using sports data and organizational research. And whenever I attend Academy, I make it a point to go to that. And you can barely find space to sit in that session. So there are people that are interested in it. But the practical reality that trying to publish sports data, at least in our organizational behavior, social psych to a certain extent, just those big general areas can be challenging at times, where it's something that I encountered with my dissertation, where I initially thought, me being the naive dot student I was at the time, like, hey, I did this one study on basketball players, I'm done. And my chair committee were like, well, not exactly. Where I did have to go do a follow-up laboratory study involving students working in groups with different task interdependent structures, building origami boats, as to look at the question of, well, what happens in real time with lower stakes when we have people performing similar reciprocally different tasks.
You're right. So yeah, just to triangulate, we must triangulate different sources of data to back up our claims. I mean, but I think it's just. It is encouraging to hear that I actually didn't know that there was a sports-related session at AOM, and I clearly missed the memo on that one the last few times that I haven't been in the last couple of years. I know it's been mostly on. Is it now only just returning to online the next one, or was it partially online this year, partially offline this year?
I think this upcoming year, because it's in August. I think, as far as I know, that is going to be, let's say, hybrid, where we're going to have a lot of the sessions in person, but there are going to be some sessions that are.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I forgot that. Yeah, the conference itself is in August. I had in my mind that damn deadline of January that everyone hates for submitting to AOM.
Oh yeah, that's one of those things we think about organizations and policies and where they started. I often wonder. And I'm pretty sure our audience is probably thinking, like, what are they talking about right now? But I often wonder who was the person to set that January deadline? Because it falls right after, or actually right in the middle of Christmas break. Now, in the past couple of years, they have taken strides to move it back a couple of weeks. But you're still ruminating and thinking about the deadline in the Christmas holidays. And I think we're one of the few fields that does that. And I've always wondered why. Was it a professor that didn't like his family that set this deadline of 7,500 years ago? I don't know the exact age of the academy right now, like, was it that, or was it this assumption that I'm done with the work of the semester, now I have time to focus on my research? I'm just really curious about how that came about.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I think it's kind of like it's a fairly open secret how everyone who attends that conference hates that deadline. And maybe to your point, maybe it was just kind of grandfathered in, and no one really kind of scrutinized why, or maybe there was like maybe there is. I mean, I don't doubt that they need a lot of, they need a decent lead-in runway to, assess all those submissions. I'm not saying that it's not for any reason, but it's so far out. And again, like to your point, the time of year and everything like that, to me, it seems like Academy might actually get better submissions if they figured that out, because to me, every single person I know when they're submitting for Academy, it's like the one scholarly submission that they dread, or they talk about it in terms that they dread, whereas it should be trying to get people in this headspace of, oh, I'm submitting for Academy of Management, it's the biggest conference in our field, I'm maybe not excited, maybe not dancing on the table about it, but not sitting there, full of dread at your Christmas table or your New Year's party going, God, I've only got 5 days to submit to Academy. It's crazy.
Yeah, it should be work that we are excited to submit and also share with the world, where, you've dealt with it and I deal with it. I submit to Academy almost every year, where in the moment you're like, goodness, I have to get this done. And, like I said previously, you're ruminating on it over Christmas while you're opening the presents, and Christmas dinner, and it's like New Year's, like, well, I only have like 5 or 6 days to get this done. And ideally we would work on it a little bit every day throughout the semester, and it would be ready to submit. But it's funny how it almost never works like that.
No,
ever.
It never works like that.
You always end up doing it like that week before it's due. Well, the majority of the work, rather.
Yeah. You do. I mean, I guess we're no better than, like our undergrad students and stuff like that. We tell them at the beginning of semester, look, I'm not going to tell you how to suck eggs. You'll do the individual assignment on your own timeline, but I'm telling you, you might want to at least think about getting a jump on it before, earlier than the day before it's due. And, we're all imperfect practitioners of our own good advice, because with something like Academy, you might, like to your point, you have the seedling of the idea, you might do a few prep things, but most of us are just jamming it in that wicked late December, early January period. So who knows, maybe it's Academy's way of like telling us, well, you should start earlier. Maybe they're sort of like taking a stand and saying, well, we've got all these like grad students and all these tenure track professors who are just like leaving stuff to the last minute. Well, that's your problem. Maybe it's their way of being, punitive for a reason, or punitive on principle or something.
Right. And I really want to know if I ever become president of Academy. No, I want to know why we do. I want to know why we have that deadline. I really want someone to tell me.
Well, man, we got to get you elevated into that position, but you've got a long career to fulfill that ambition. And I just want to wrap things up here, just on the point of the other side of your burgeoning career here. Of course, being a professor at a business school isn't all research. You got teaching, you got service. I mean, service, we can perhaps, there's always trade secrets associated with service and stuff, so we can maybe table that for another time. But teaching, what classes are you teaching at the moment? And like, what are some of your general philosophies and pedagogical approaches that you employ in your work as an educator day to day?
Well, I teach a variety of classes, since I'm at a smaller university, which I love having smaller classes. I would say on average, I have about 12 to 15 students in most of my classes, which is wonderful. And when I tell my colleagues from other universities that, they kind of looking like, oh, like, well, it is what it is. But I teach principles of management, both for undergraduate and graduate students, negotiations, conflict resolution, and organizational behavior, where I strongly believe that when I think about all these fancy terms and theories and models that we use in our field of management, inquiry, and research that I don't want my students to memorize things, whether it be models, theories, Vroom's model of this or plan and behavior model. But rather, I think for the most part, and this is what I actually love about business and management, that we actually, before we ever step into a classroom and learn these things, we intuitively understand 90 to 95% of this content. But it just hasn't been presented to us in the way that textbooks and the structure of courses and syllabi and all those things we use to convey this information does. Where I lean a lot on my students' experience, their both workplace experiences, real life experiences, and things like that, where I think it's important for, again, not to memorize these things or know every theory to the absolute T, because most of my students are going to be practitioners. I actually haven't had a student yet to enter academia, which I guess I could do a better job. I don't know.
Don't be hard on yourself.
But for the most part, they're going to be practitioners, and I want them to leave class every day with things that they can go out immediately when they leave my classroom. Well, not necessarily 9 o'clock at night if it's a night class, but they can leave immediately and they can apply both to the workplace and their lives to improve their lives. Where I take my negotiations course, for example, where oftentimes we don't think about our interactions in life like this, but we negotiate a lot. Negotiation isn't always sitting down across from a person, across the table from a person and discussing price and options and positions and interest and all those things. But rather, negotiation could be something as simple as deciding what you're going to eat for dinner that night, or what you're going to do with your friends on a Friday night, or things like that, where it's not necessarily, I'm not saying we're going to apply these rigid models of negotiation and things like that to these situations. That would be a little weird. But rather, I want people to, take some of these things they learn in the class, such as understanding positions versus interests, reservation points and things like that, and apply them to these day-to-day interactions, to make their life better, and also the lives of their family and friends, colleagues, coworkers, whoever they come across.
That's awesome. And that really just speaks to, why all you would do it in the first place, right? I mean, really, you're keeping the pedagogy consistent with the desired outcomes for most people, right? I mean, I think something you said very, very importantly there, and something I'm fully on board with. I mean, just the idea that you're only going to be able to go so far with students that are who want to go on to be practitioners when it comes to quoting theories and frameworks and stuff from from the textbook. I mean, I teach principles of management as well. I'm not sure if you're using Robbins and Coulter. You might be using a different textbook at Laverne, but I say at the beginning of in teaching OB as well. I teach junior OB and OB for MBAs as well. I always frame the first class with, guys, the textbook is not something I chose. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm not saying the textbook's bad. The textbook is a resource. No doubt each of you will get at least one, or if not 10, 20, 100 perhaps, good insights from reading that textbook. But this is not the focus, right? I'm not trying to give you like you guys are not going to benefit at all, especially as practitioner-minded people. You folks are not going to benefit from an overt emphasis on conceptual knowledge, which is more of interest to someone like myself, who actually studies this stuff and is paid to have a strong, firm conceptual knowledge of this stuff. It's like the analogy I would draw is like, say, a doctor learning biology. Now, does a doctor need a fundamental understanding of biology at a conceptual and practical level? Yes, absolutely. But when a doctor is actually practicing medicine, are they consistently making conceptual references to sort of like the things that they learned in, Bio 101? No, because it's kind of a background assumption, right? It's kind of a, it's a background assumption that the blood pumps this way, that the body works this way and so forth. And I think it can be the same with management. We can have people who, get their foundations from people like us, get the broad strokes from the textbook, but our job as educators is more, how can we get this focused on practice as quickly and as effectively as possible?
Yeah, absolutely. Where at the end of the day, we want our students to leave our classes and our universities once they graduate. Of course, absolutely being better people, but also being able to better understand the world around them and how to have that impact on the world instead of just memorizing theories and models and things directly out of the textbook. Where also ultimately my goal is to not necessarily in an absolute sense tell my students like this is how you should think about these situations in the workplace, but rather introduce them to these theories and ideas that help them, think about things, in their own way, depending on their understanding of the world, their history, their values, beliefs, and things like that.
Yeah, and that's what matters, right? And look, I mean, if we could make that the emphasis, then maybe people like you and I won't have to field these questions from a class like, Dr. Craze, what's the difference between charismatic and transformational leadership? Because I really don't understand, and I'm just kind of like, well, kid, if I had a good answer for you, I would give it to you right now. But, I'm just kind of going off the textbook. I really should know the difference, but I can't make sense of it myself. So, yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. That should be the motive. That should be the emphasis, not rehashing a history lesson out of a textbook based on situational leadership theory or the Fiedler model or something like that. And no disrespect, all of that is all interesting in and of itself, but not necessarily what we want our students focusing on. But we have come to the end of the proverbial tape and the actual time for our discussion today. But man, it's been real joy having you on. I've really enjoyed dialoguing with you over the years. I really appreciate the support of the podcast. Again, I love your dissertation work, and I'm really, happy that you're, really kicking along there at Laverne and, making a real fist of your career there. I've got no doubt there's so much more great research coming out of you, and, students are going to benefit from all your teaching wisdom and your philosophy to teaching, and that Laverne's going to greatly benefit from your service to the department. So just keep on doing what you do, man. It's been, a real pleasure having you on, and hopefully we can do this again sometime.
All right. Thank you. Really appreciate the opportunity to be on the pod.
All right, man. Well, until next time, take care of yourself.
All right. Will do.
Cheers. Bye.
And it got me thinking.